Dear friends, I'm so glad to see you, and we continue our course of video lectures dedicated to the works of contemporary English-speaking writers in the course of editing the text. Thank you for watching me. So, we continue talking about the novel by British author Julian Barnes, and the novel that is actually having a very interesting structure that looks like a collection of short stories, and it is called A History of the World in 10.5 chapters. It was published in 1989, and in the previous lecture we discussed the first 6 chapters. But now let's have a look at the last chapters. First of all, have a look at the chapter 7. It's called 3 Simple Stories, and it portrays a survivor from the Royal Majesty's ship Titanic, the biblical story of Jonah and the whale, and the Jewish refugees on board of the ship St. Louis and in 1939, who were prevented from landing in the United States and other countries. Then there is a chapter 8, Upstream, and here be careful. Since the book is called The History of the World in 10.5 chapters, there is kind of a half chapter, the unnumbered parenthesis, as it is called, and then there they go, the chapter 9, Project Ararat, and chapter 10, The Dream. Have a look at the structure of this novel. It is very, very unusual. Now, first of all, we don't really have the numeration that has halves in between the chapters. That such thing doesn't exist in literature. We don't have half chapters, we only have chapters, okay? And so this is a postmodernist irony of the author, who is trying to shake a little bit the common structure of the novel, and altogether we can say that he doesn't make something very, very new, okay? First of all, because before he was even born, there was published a book by an Italian author called Giovanni Boccaccio, and the book was called Decameron. Actually, this is a very interesting book, and there are 10 narrators who tell 10 stories. But in fact, in this book, they are 101 story. One novella is actually told by an author. Okay, so basically it's 101, and even that is not new, because we know about a piece of like a masterpiece of Arabic literature that is called 100 Nights and a Night. Okay, and the name of it implies that the story is not finished. The story carries going on and on. So let's talk a bit about the postmodernist features of this book. And the first of them, as we discussed, is the structure. Okay, the structure is very unusual. It's the history of the world in 10.5 chapters, but one of the chapters is actually half of the chapter. And also look at the chapter 7. It is 3 different stories united in one chapter. Again, that doesn't happen often, and this is also an attempt to modernize, to kind of deconstruct the common and accepted structure of conventional novel. Okay? Next thing, the chronotope. The chronotope of this book is also very unusual. Now, chronotope means the time and the space inside the book, okay? Most commonly are not quite real, they are artistic, okay? But how much time normally do we have described in the novel, okay? Let me give you an example. The novel by Leo Tolstoy, War and Peace, starts the narration in the year of 1805, more or less, or a little before that, okay? And ends up more or less in 1820 to 1821, okay? And so it describes an extremely long period for a novel, which is about 15 to 17 years. So this is called an epic novel. Okay, so the chronotope of War and Peace describes a period of time that is almost 17 years or more. Okay, now the chronotope of this particular book is unprecedentedly long. You can see that it starts the description from Noah's Ark, which is the time immemorial. Okay, and it ends up with the chapter 10, that is actually the dream, that is describing the hereafter. Do you quite understand the word hereafter? It means the life after death. So it describes a certain kind, a certain version of heaven, which is not even now, which is somewhere in the future, or maybe somewhere after the time is finished. We don't know. Okay? So the chronotope of this unique piece of literature is almost endless, because it starts with mythological time, with the times of Noah and his ark, that is very hard to describe in terms of contemporary history. And most obviously, it doesn't fit into anywhere in the calendar that we are using. And the novel ends up with the reality that doesn't fit into the conventional understanding of time. So that's why the chronotope of this novel is practically endless. This is also quite interesting. Now, the other interesting postmodernist feature of this novel is that each short story has its own characters, its own plot, and by no means it is not an episode of a certain storyline, but the stories are connected between each other by some textual features that are not a part of the plot, that are not actually a part of narration. They are motives, themes, and some characters that are actually insects, the woodworms, which is actually also an experiment. So, in a way, we can say that this novel, this book, as we can call it, is expanding the borders of literature very much. And it shows what actually are the perspectives of literature, what the writer can do if he plans to write a book that goes far beyond the conventional limits of what we call fiction. Now, let's have a look at the chapter 7 and the 3 simple stories. Now, the chapter portrays a person who is actually a real person, a survivor from the ship Titanic. And then the second part describes the story of the prophet Jonah and the whale by describing a real person who was swallowed by a whale but remained alive. And the Jewish refugees on board of a ship St. Louis in 1939 who tried to escape from the Nazi Germany but are not accepted in any way by the United States and other countries. You know what? Let me start with the last story. Let's try to analyze it a little bit. Don't you find that this is a bitter irony of the author comparing it with Noah's Ark? First of all, quite obviously, Jewish refugees are connected with the plot of Old Testament, but Noah's Ark was designed to save people, and the passengers of the ship St. Louis, who actually took it in 1939, first of all are deprived of any kind of property that they've had back in Germany, and second, they are not accepted by any country that they arrive to. This is a very, very strong paradox, because they only arrive to Christian countries, countries that in their sermons, the priests teach to be merciful, but in a way, the governments of these countries are found to be merciless to the people who try to escape a certain death. Okay, so most of the passengers of this ship are returned back to the Nazi Germany, where they face their fate. Now, the second story is about a mariner, a sailor, who was actually swallowed by a whale. We can imagine to ourselves that it was a sperm whale, okay, because that's the only whale that can swallow a game big enough as a human being, okay. So the sailor surprisingly stays alive, unconscious, okay, and when the sperm whale is caught by another ship's crew and is separated into pieces, surprisingly, in the stomach of the whale, they discover an alive sailor who is unconscious and who is absolutely white because the juice of the stomach of the whale deprived his body of the pigment that makes the hair and the skin a little black or suntan. And this is actually a testimony to the truthfulness of the biblical story of the prophet Jonah, who was swallowed by the whale and spent 3 days inside its womb. And now, the first story is actually quite funny. It tells a life story of a passenger of Titanic who probably rescued himself by pretending he is a woman. So he actually entered the lifeboat and was rescued, but he rescued his life by cheating. Okay, so he arrived to the land, and somewhere in the washroom he changed a female dress or a male dress, and he survived long enough to be a consultant for the movie, one of the first movies that was made about Titanic. So he was invited, but the director of the movie didn't want him to be on the ship, even though it is a model of a ship. The ship is not real, but he didn't want him to be among the crowd of people who pretend to be the members of the crew and the passengers of Titanic. But he illegally, of course, again illegally, he enters that ship and stays within the people when, according to the plot of the movie, the ship is about to drown. But quite funny, the director looks at the crowd, sees that man, stops shooting, and says, "Hey, can you please go outside the ship?" and expels him from the board of Titanic. Just like God did when actually Titanic, the real Titanic, was sinking. So this is an unbelievable story, and it's funny in a way. And you know what is an epigraph for this story? Actually, it is an epitaph of a famous British poet called John Gay. Have a look at this on the slide. The epitaph goes like this: "Life is a jest, and all things show it. I thought so once, but now I know it." It is an extremely smart beginning of a short story where a person rescues from Titanic twice in his life. But first time it was a real case, and second time it was just shooting a movie. Now, the 8th chapter is describing the letters from an actor who travels to remote jungle for shooting a movie. Here you can see another loose connection between chapter 7 and chapter 8. Actually, they're both about shooting a movie. But if in the first case it is shooting a movie about Titanic. In the second case, the whole plot is concentrated on the relationship of the actor and his wife. In the beginning of this story, their relationship is extremely good. They love each other, but the deeper the actor goes into the jungle, the more profound his understanding of life and its complexity becomes. And we can see it only by letters he sends. So basically you can see the genre of this short story is very different from the other stories. And this is also a part of a literary experiment by Julian Barnes. Okay, so we can see that his letters grow more philosophical and complicated as he deals with the living situations. The personalities of his co-stars and the director, and the peculiarities of the indigenous population. And the short story is coming to a climax when his colleague is drowned in an accident with a raft. The absurd death of a person who didn't even start shooting in a movie shakes him all over, and he writes a farewell letter to his wife and decides to part with her. So this is the end of that short story. Their love out of a sudden was gone because he experienced something that his life obviously would never experience, and he has got nothing to share with her. He is very hesitant that she could understand that. Now, immediately after this comes half a chapter called parentheses, and here in this chapter, in different style from the other short stories, narrator addresses us, his readers, and offers a philosophical discussion on love. In many ways it looks like an essay of a student or maybe a scholar on the topic of love described in several verses of famous British poets. And he states the reader cannot be sure that the narrator's opinions are those of the author, because obviously it is a literary mask. So we cannot really associate the narrator here with Julian Barnes, and that gives the author some kind of safety. A parallel is drawn with El Greco's painting, Burial of the Count of Orgas, in which the artist confronts the viewer. There is a great distance between us and the author, and he is trying to talk to us as if the pages of the book do not connect but separate us. Okay, so the piece includes a discussion of lines from Philip Larkin's poem and Arundel Tomb, and the verse by the poet W.H. Auden, September the 1st, 1939. Let me please introduce the first verse, the verse by Philip Larkin. Now, here is a picture of Arundel Tomb, and that is actually a grave, obviously of a knight and his wife, and even after death, long after their bodies were buried, they still hold each other's hand in eternal love. That is probably the ambition of the sculpture. So let's have a look at the verse. Side by side, their faces blurred, the earl and the countess lie on the stone, their proper habits vaguely shown, as joint at armor, stiffened plead, and that faint hint of the absurd, the little dogs under their feet. Time has transfigured them into untruth. The stone fidelity they hardly meant has come to be their final blazon, and to prove our almost instinct, almost true. What will survive of us is love. So Julian Barnes is discussing that verse in the context of all the previous short stories. He implies that in the relationship of many characters, the crisis was provoked by the death of love, by the death of understanding each other and common trust. Okay, so he proclaims love as the greatest engine of humanity, as the background of any noble action that can possibly happen in this world. And to confirm his point of view, he is giving a short story by Wister's Hugh Auden. He is giving us a part of his poem that is called September the 1st, 1939. Let me invite you to read a part of it. All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority, whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. So basically you can see this as almost a statement of love as the moral value that is eternal and is the motivator of the greatest thing that were ever made by humanity. But here we come to the 9th chapter, and the name of it is Project Ararat. This chapter tells the story of fictional astronaut Spike Tigler, based on the astronaut James Irwin. Tigler launches an expedition to recover what remains of Noah's Ark. And this is a very funny story. Actually, while he is up in the space, during that space flight, out of a sudden, he hears the inside voice, or maybe just the voice in his head, that says to him, "Find Noah's Ark." "What?" says he to his colleague, to his partner, and the partner says, "I didn't say anything." And then he hears this voice once again, "Find Noah's Ark." And he's not even sure if it is an illusion or hallucination or reality. But when he comes down, that becomes his idea fix. And he is planning an expedition, obviously to the Mount Ararat. And when he's going up the mountain, he finds, surprisingly, a cave. And inside the cave, he finds the remnants of a human body. So he says, "I've found Noah." Wow, this is a great moment. But then his partners say, let's collect these remnants and let's send them to the lab so that they will date them. And actually, the results of the analysis say that actually there are the bones of the person who lived most likely in the 19th century, and highly likely they are the bones of a woman. Dear friends, do you remember I asked you to remember the end of the chapter 6, and we saw Miss Ferguson, who was actually traveling up the Mount Ararat and died there and remained in the cave. So quite obviously that this character, Spike Tigler, instead of finding the body of Noah, discovered the remnants of a poor woman. Now, this irony doesn't have any anti-religious context. Actually, it is the other way around. It says that the sacred things, they will remain sacred. It's quite pointless to look for the remnants of Noah's Ark. It's quite pointless to look for the true, true grapes that are the descendants of those grapes that Noah brought with him on his ship. Because if you believe it, this is true for you. And if you don't believe it, nothing is going to make it true. Okay? And that's where we're coming to the last chapter, the chapter 10, which actually portrays New Heaven. And this is a stinging satire. This is a bitter irony of the author, because actually heaven, paradise, the hereafter for him is somewhat of a five-star beach hotel connected with a shopping center. And this, when you read this, you understand that this is the perception of paradise by our contemporary, a member of a culture of consumption, a person who wants to have a rest in a hotel and to shop in a shopping mall. This is paradise for him. The old idea of paradise is no longer legitimate. That's what the meaning of this chapter is. And you know, when you complete reading this book and you finish the last page, obviously you have a sense of pleasure that goes far beyond the sense of pleasure after reading any other average book. Because you have a feeling that by completing this book you have completed at least 10 books. Oh no, sorry, my fault, 10 and a half books. And for an editor, of course, for an editor who is editing the translation of this book, this job, this task is extremely challenging, because all the small things that connect the chapters between each other, all the small meanings, for instance, the same character, Miss Ferguson, who dies in the chapter 6 and then is discovered in the chapter 9, must overlap, must coincide, because otherwise, in the translation, the whole plot and structure of this book is going to be absolutely meaningless. So all the small things like the motives and the themes and the way they are expressed in the original text must be preserved very carefully in the translation. And this obviously is a special task that must be performed by an editor. Dear friends, I was so glad to discuss with you this masterpiece of the 20th century, and I hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much for watching me, and have a good time. Bye.